I am really happy to introduce Stuart Layton from BitSite Technologies, but his bio was very short, and I don't know Stuart personally yet, but hopefully that'll change over the next 2 days. It's neuroscientist, PhD turned data, and maybe you can actually talk a little bit more about, and then make sure you talk about Wi-Fi. And one last thing, I've been asked to ask you to tweet more about the event if you are tweeting, and I will ask you to eat more and eat in here. So tweet and eat. And then when you have questions, I'm going to watch for you, and I'm going to run to you with a mic because we need to get your questions on the recording, okay? Great. Take it away, Stuart. Thank you.
Sure. Can you all hear me on the mic? Okay, cool. So unfortunately, I didn't provide a very rich bio to Lisa, so I'm going to introduce myself a little bit. As I'm doing that, I'm going to probably share the most important slide first, which is the Wi-Fi SSID and password. So go ahead and write that down as I talk. Like Lisa said, I'm actually a neuroscientist by training. I did both my bachelor's and a PhD in neuroscience. I studied both the mechanisms of drug addiction and the mechanisms of dreaming in rats. So long story short, if you give rats something rewarding and make them run through a maze to get it, when they go to sleep and they actually dream about running through the maze. It's sort of like the Tetris phenomenon when you'd play Tetris for 8 hours. When you'd go to sleep, all you would see is like falling blocks till like you were ready to poke your eyes out. But I had a really great time as a neuroscientist, sort of exploring the foundations of like who we are, but I really didn't like the sort of the academic environment, and I became allergic to rats. And so when the literally. So when the opportunity came to come work for BitSite, I've always had a strong interest in both computers and computer security. And so when the opportunity arose to basically come and do some scientific research for BitSite, I jumped on that opportunity, and I've been having a great time. And I'm really excited to share with you some of the stuff we've been working on recently. Last year, Stephen presented, sort of showed some of the stuff we're doing with regards to modeling infection data across organizations. And this is sort of the next generation of models we're doing, but it's completely unrelated to that stuff. So going back, the title is Effectiveness of Anti-Spoofing Controls. This is going to be a total nerd out, so I'm going to try and go slow, explain a few concepts that maybe I left out. But just a quick question. Has anyone, who here understands how the DNS system works, or the domain name servers work? Okay, so there's enough of you who didn't raise your hands that I'm going to go into that a little bit. But to give you a quick overview of why I'm even talking about spoofing, and particularly email spoofing, the email system we all use every single day was built long before anyone ever thought the internet was going to be a real viable thing. And so email actually is not really even authenticated. I could log into a web server, type some messages, and generate a spoofed email from any sender in the world. I could send Stephen an email from Bill Gates at Microsoft.com. I could send Alex Hutton an email from Selena Kyle at EA.com. I mean, anyone in the world. And this has actually proven to be quite problematic. So I'm going to talk about a few controls that exist to prevent this. I'm going to then share some measurements we've made about these controls, about how well they're being adopted, and how effective people are in actually using these controls, and then just share a few take-home messages. So like I explained earlier, anyone can forge the sender's email address on an email. I could send anyone an email from any sending address. Now, this is commonly exploited as a way to get people to open emails that they wouldn't normally open. And a few sort of outcomes of that are you can distribute malware, you can spread misinformation, and you can actually use this to execute phishing attacks. In the Verizon DBIR, they actually cite that phishing is involved in 67% of cyber espionage attacks. Now, an example of the spread of misinformation, actually, there was back in 2013, there was an email that went out to a news organization saying some small tech firm was going to be bought by Samsung, and it was sent from the CEO of this tech firm. Immediately, the story was published, the stock price went up 50%, and then within hours, this company's like, hey, we did not send that email, that was not us, and the stock price crashed, but somebody made a lot of money in those few hours, simply by spoofing the email address of the CEO of this company. Now, you'd think that people wouldn't be able to do that, but you can. So to prevent Well, and so why should you care as that you're going to be spoofed? What can you do to prevent your company from being spoofed? Well, you don't want other third parties pretending to be you. You don't want your customers, your clients, anyone who trusts you to basically take a message from somebody else and believe it's from you. And mainly because this can lead to reputation risk. This company lost some reputation when everyone thought Samsung was going to buy it. When you open emails from PayPal or from your bank that are fraudulent, that sort of gives you a bad taste for PayPal and eBay. And so generally people want to control their reputation and lock down their assets. So 2 controls that exist are sender policy framework, which basically, what happened? Oh. Okay. Okay. I'll just touch that every few minutes. Okay. Basically, SPF, or Sender Policy Framework, allows you as an organization to say what IP addresses or what servers are allowed to send email on behalf of your organization. The other is called Domain Keys Identified Mail, which actually allows you to cryptographically sign email going out to verify that it was actually sent by your web servers, by your mail servers. Now, I'll give you a quick overview of how SPF actually works. So let's say I wake up and I've got an email in my mailbox from Elon Musk at PayPal, and the subject is, you want a Tesla, and there's an attachment that says claimmyprize.pdf. I'm kind of savvy. I know that PDFs can be weaponized, but this is from Elon Musk at PayPal. He's giving me a Tesla. There's some risk of not opening this PDF, right? Like, I want a Tesla. But there's a few weird things, like it's coming from PayPal, and Elon Musk would probably email me from Tesla. Well, why don't I just look at the IP address of who sent me this email? Turns out it came from someone at Cisco. Well, Cisco has email service providers. Maybe PayPal is using Cisco. I don't know what to do here. SPF solves this problem. Now, when you go to a website, when you open your browser and type www.google.com, those are sort of human-readable addresses. Computers don't use those addresses. They actually use IP addresses or numbers to communicate. The domain name servers and domain name system is actually a way for us to basically, is a way for computers to translate those names into bits of information that they can use. So there's I can use the domain name system to do a lookup on paypal.com, and I'm just asking for a text record. And if PayPal has implemented SPF, what I'll get back is a record that looks like this. It will say, hey, this text record, you're going to include these other 2 domains. One is the paypalspf.com domain and the spfebay.com domain. And then this little tilde all at the end means, and anyone else, you can probably ignore them. You should not expect email from anywhere else. So I do a secondary lookup on this PayPal SPF domain, and I get back a list of IP addresses. So there's this 216.13.1896. And these are actually CIDRs, but there's a few hundred email IPs returned here. And I can then just compare the IP address that I got with these list of IP addresses. I realize that this IP is not an authorized sender, and so I throw the email away as being spam. So I know that this was a fraudulent email, because if it had been sent by someone at PayPal, it would not have come from that IP address. Now, a few examples of some valid, very simple SPF records. If you look up IBM's SPF record, you get this. Basically, it says -all, which means no one ever, no one anywhere should ever send an email from IBM.com. If you get an email from IBM.com, it's fraudulent. But IBM has to send email. So what they do is they use this subdomain, us.ibm.com, where they actually have a pretty complex SPF record that enumerates a few IP address blocks and a few mail servers. Now, here's a few bad SPF records. So this guy, ms8051org, no clue who they are. They use Google as their mail server, but instead of putting vspf1 include Google, they actually included this little insert colon. So they have a bad record. So they took what Google gave them and copied and pasted too much. If we look up Walmart, Walmart has a nice record with a bunch of IPs in there, but then it says include the record for wal-mart.com. So then we have to do a lookup on wal-mart.com, and that says include Walmart. And this actually introduces sort of a cyclical dependency, which invalidates the whole record. So Walmart put a lot of time and effort into crafting their SPF record, but it's ineffective. It doesn't work. Mail servers effectively ignore it. Now, when we at BitSite validate someone's SPF record, we do it in a few ways. First, we just verify that the record is syntactically correct. So in the case of this guy, this one syntactically is incorrect. We also verify the semantics of the record. Are they actually following the RFC? The Walmart one is semantically incorrect. And then lastly, we measure the number of approved IP addresses. So I could have a record that follows the spec, that is semantically correct, but it approves any IP address on the internet to send email. I mean, it's semantically correct, it's syntactically correct, but it just is too loose. It's not an effective control. And here are a few examples of our grades of records for HP, a company you've all heard of. HP.com has no SPF record. That's pretty bad. Anyone, if SPF were the only control, anyone could forge an email from HP.com, and a mail server wouldn't have any way to tell if it's valid. Compact.com is the same way. If we come down, if we look it up, it's missing. If we go down to survey.hp.com, there's actually a pretty good SPF record here that allows about 131 IP addresses to send email. Now, a malicious actor can do these lookups and figure out these lists of IP addresses, and now they have a set of targets that they now need to hack, exploit, to then send fraudulent email on behalf of this domain. Emails.snapfish, this is one of HP's subsidiaries that does online photos. They too have an SPF record. They have this -all at the end, which means anyone not in this list, don't allow them. But if you count the number of IP addresses they approve, they've got about 1,500. So it's an order of magnitude more than the other guy. It's an order of magnitude more targets that can be exploited. The risk is growing here. If someone wants to spoof Snapfish, there's more targets that they can use to do that. Now, the DKIM. So I get another email the other day from the Zuck at facebook.com. The subject line is LOL WTF, and it's got this attachment that says not an exploit.pdf. You know, there's like 4 red alarms going off right now, and if I were a mail server, I'd throw this thing right away. But this email is special. It actually has this nice little tag set at the bottom that says, hey, this thing's been signed using DKIM. It's got this RSA SHA-256 key. And if you want to know the public key that goes with this email, you can actually find it using this facebook.com using this selector called Brisbane. So then the mail server asks the DNS system, hey, is there a record at brisbane.domainkeys.facebook.com? And I may get an answer, I may not get an answer. And in this case, we get this nice blob of text that basically says, hey, we have an RSA key, and this is the public key that goes with this key set. My mail server has the public key. It has the signed message. It can then actually validate that, hey, this message actually was signed with that key. Let's accept it. And when it comes to how we at BitSite evaluate DKIM implementations, we really go on, are these implementations, is the syntax correct? And are they using sufficiently strong keys? 2048 is sort of the industry accepted norm. Previously, there was a story where Google was using a 512-bit key, and so sort of this bored mathematician found out. You can sort of guess what happened next, where he cracked the key, and then he sent an email to Larry Page from Sergey Brin, from Sergey's email account address, and he simply signed it using the private key that he was able to break using their public key. And he was expecting to get like an email back. It was sort of like his way to try and get a job. And he didn't hear back. And then 2 days later, he did another lookup of Google's DKIM key, and it had jumped to 2048 bits. So this is a real thing that can be exploited by both malicious and sort of malicious actors and bored mathematicians. So going back to pick on HP again, these guys are actually doing a pretty good job when it comes to DKIM. They have a few records, like this domain key Extreme HP, where for some reason they've deployed a test key, which is ineffective, but we don't penalize them for that. But they had no bad DKIM keys. Now, I'm talking about these SPF records on companies. I'm talking about these domain keys. But I imagine you're wondering, like, where are we actually getting this data? Like, what we have is we have access to a real-time passive DNS stream. And what that means is whenever a mail server receives an email that is from a domain, it does the SPF lookup and then it does the DKIM lookup. And we're able to sort of sit in the middle of that transaction and only see the responses. So we don't know who's requesting these records. We don't know exactly when they're requesting the records. All we know is that the SPF or DKIM record was requested and we get the response to it. And so we're able to log those requests. We're getting about 100 million lookups a day. And sort of using some of the tools that BitSight's built out, we are then able to map all these records to the organizations that they belong to. Now keep in mind that this is not an exhaustive set of all the SPF records or DKIM records that may exist in an organization. This is simply the ones that are in use. Now, going back to the HP.com example, there was no record there. But somebody did a lookup, which means somebody is sending email from HP.com. And that means either HP isn't in control of their assets, they don't know what domains they're using, or some third party is sending email on behalf of HP. To give you a sort of an anecdote, I've been told I cannot share specific names, but there was a large technology company you have heard of that did not have SPF record on one of their primary domains. They set up the SPF record, and the next day, 50 million spam messages disappeared off the internet. So these are very simple, effective controls that organizations should be using. Organizations, their reputations are being abused every day, and they need to take control over those. So to give you an idea of the breadth of the data, we have data on roughly 12,000 different organizations. We've collected data on roughly 1.2 million domains across 21 industries. Some of the companies you've probably heard of. We have data on Northrop Grumman, Boeing, L3 Communications is a satellite company. This is just a few in the aerospace industry. Looking at the retail industry, we've got a few: Best Buy, Home Depot, Carrefour. We have estimates of how many employees work at those companies and roughly the number of record lookups we've observed for those companies.
With respect to the source of the data, sorry. You know where I'm going. You can repeat my question if I, okay, so I got the mic working. That's great. So with respect to the source of the data, I'm surmising that as part of your commercial service, you essentially listen to responses sent by the authoritative name servers for your customer domains, and you then infer that queries are being made potentially by evildoers.
Well, the queries are being, we infer that queries are being made by receiving mail servers. So somebody, well, or by security researchers, or by some bored kid who's learning how to use DIG. But it's the signal we're really trying to tap into is that an email was received, and somebody was trying to validate that email.
But if it was received, it had to have been sent, and it was sent in this case to somebody who's your customer, and thus you can see the DNS replies that were sent. Okay.
Yes, exactly. Did everyone catch that? Did anyone miss that? Okay. So this is to sort of give you a sort of a broad a view of the breadth of our data. And to sort of show you some of the raw data. So in this point, in this chart, every dot is an individual company. So there's roughly 12,000 dots in this chart. The x-axis is the number of employees we've measured for that organization. And the y-axis is the number of records we've observed generated for that organization. There's a strong linear trend that exists here in log space, which is not surprising given that larger organizations are going to have more assets, they're going to have more people sending emails, and they're going to be more likely to be targeted for abuse. And so these large organizations, they either have more SPF records because they're controlling their systems, they're controlling their assets, or they're being abused more often. To sort of skin this another way, we can then look to see, well, given a set of good SPF records, how many bad SPF records do we have for those same organizations? And what we find, so I drew the 1-1 line here for convenience, and I was actually I was shocked when I saw this, but we see that most of the organizations lie above the 1-1 line, which means for every good record, they have more bad records than they have good records, which means they're executing quite poorly here. So there are, the majority of organizations here are at risk of being the target of a spoofing attack. And then to look at sort of the percent of all their records that are valid. So the x-axis here is how many SPF records we observe for an organization. The y-axis is, of those records, what percent of them do we consider good of the total? This banding and the quantization is just the effect of, if you have a single SPF record, it's either perfectly bad or perfectly good. And so there's sort of no middle ground. When you have two, the choices are 0, 50, 100%. 3, you have 0, 33, 66, 100%. But what's striking is, again, as the records go up, the percentage of records that are good goes down. We can split this and sort of cut this down at 15 records, look at the distribution, and we find that while there are a large number of organizations that are executing well, they have nearly perfect set of records, there's a ton that are doing poorly. And if we take it to organizations that have more than 15 records, the distribution skews even worse. There's almost nobody who has a lot of records that's doing perfect. Now, we can take it even one step further, look at organizations that have at least 100 records, and you're almost either perfectly terrible or perfect. And this right here is actually LinkedIn. LinkedIn has roughly 100 records, and only one of them's bad, which would make sense given that LinkedIn has been historically abused when it comes to email spoofing. They're a trusted organization. People expect to receive emails from them. They open the links. They download the attachments. They follow they click on the links. And so LinkedIn has really had to respond to this kind of abuse, whereas other organizations have not. Now, we have a few other metrics that we can compare this to. In the abstract, I said I would compare this to other metrics on organizations. So one of the other projects we've been working on that I wish I would have had, it wasn't quite done when I submitted the abstract, so I couldn't talk about it in depth there. But we've actually had a project where we've been collecting SSL certificates and measuring the effectiveness of SSL implementations across the internet. It was spawned by the very popular Heartbleed vulnerability you've probably heard of. And what we found is that, again, as the number of SPF records in an organization goes up, we find that the number of SSL certificates used by that organization also goes up. This relationship is probably primarily driven by the larger the organization, the more records they're going to have. But if we look at how effective people are at maintaining their SSL certificates versus maintaining their SPF records, we actually find a pretty interesting relationship. There's this nice blob of entities up here in the top corner who are highly effective at SSL, but terribly ineffective at SPF, which was surprising. Question?
So when you're measuring this SSL effectiveness, is this based on what are the types of certificates that they're generating? So is it signed by RSA, or is it signed by DSA, or something a little bit better? Or is this, what does the server respond as valid algorithms that it can use for the encryption, right? Because there's kind of two different measures there.
So we started out by doing a very exhaustive scan where we basically tried all the different algorithms a server might respond with, and we got blacklisted by everyone.
That's what happens, yeah.
That's what happens. And so we had to scale back our how aggressive we were being. And so right now, the two main tests are we download the certificate, we check to see if the certificate is valid, the key length of the certificate, the signing algorithm of the certificate, how many, the length of the public key. And additionally, we, with the help of a third party, actually attempt to exploit a Heartbleed for a few bits. And if it's heartbleed vulnerable, it fails. And if the certificate has ever been used in conjunction with a heartbleed failure, the certificate fails. So it's not the best validation of SSL, but it's a good approximation.
No, it's good. It's just that I have seen certificate enumerations, and it's awesome to mine that data, but I haven't seen an SSL server response enumeration yet. I haven't seen anything like that. So.
I mean, we have some of that data, but again, it's extremely hard because you're hitting these servers with dozens of requests, and you piss a lot of people off. But it's something we'd love to figure out how to do at scale. And again, so last year, Stephen presented a lot of our malware infection data, how effective are organizations at identifying compromises on their machines and both patching their systems and removing that malware. And we can actually look to see how many botnet infections are there at organizations compared to how many SPF records they have. There's a nice, strong linear trend here. Again, we think that this relationship is mainly explained by the size of the organization. But if we account for size and look at, well, of all the SPF records, what % of them are valid? And if we look for this normalized infection rate, which basically tries to account how big an organization is, we see that, first of all, there's a very, very weak correlation here. But again, there's this nice little bulb down here in the bottom where the bigger you are, the more infected you get, and the more poorly you perform. So a few take-homes are that SPF and DKIM are actually quite effective controls for spoofing attacks. These are things that are easy to set up, they're easy to validate, and most organizations just are failing to do it. And these are real risks that they face. There are real risks that they face associated with these attacks.
Is SPF validation and DNSKIM, are those the only two-way or two ways, or the most effective two ways to measure what you're talking about? Are there other things companies could be doing, for example, that might mitigate what you're seeing in your data?
So there are a variety of measurements we're doing with regards to how well are companies responding to current infections, how well are companies responding to known exploits and patches, how well are companies doing at locking down their assets. SPF and DKIM are the two sort of gold standard controls for preventing email spoofing attacks. And so for this sort of subset of measurements, they're what we're choosing to measure. There are other things you can measure, but these tend to give us the strongest signal and the best across the largest number of organizations.
Okay, thanks.
Okay. Again, the take-home is the bigger you are, the harder you fall, the harder you fail. It's actually not that difficult for an organization to set up sort of a wildcard SPF record. Basically, where if the SPF record isn't defined, you just block everything. And we see almost no organizations doing that. So this is stuff we've been working on over the last 6 months. It's actually not been myself, but it's been some work with one of my co-data scientists, Tom Montroy, who built the original SSL scanner that got us blacklisted and almost cut us off completely. And Dan Dahlberg, he's a QA engineer. We pulled him over from Cisco, and this guy knows the DNS system better than anyone I know. We've been working on this for the last few months, and we're really happy with it. So that's basically the talk. Any questions left?
Got time for questions, so feel free. Oh, here.
So I understand your company collects a lot of information from the internet to try to pull it together in aggregate form to characterize how relatively, I'll just say, how much badness there is in IP addresses. How much more informative is this piece of information? Does it add completely new insights, or does it refine what you already know, and how does it come together as a whole?
So great question. So we did quite a bit of analysis trying to look for correlations between the two signals. Actually, we tried to compute like the mutual information that they carry, and it's pretty low. And that's one of the things that we found very exciting, because if it was a completely complementary signal, we were just sort of agreeing with ourselves. But this is sort of a secondary metric, an orthogonal axis that, while it's not necessarily as informative, it provides additional breadth to the entire data set that we then provide to individuals who want to make their own decisions about risk. And one of the things I sort of failed to elaborate on at the beginning is, while we sell what we call a risk rating to organizations, the real value add we feel like we provide is allowing organizations to see the breadth of data on their partners and on themselves, because they understand the context and their risks better than we do. And that allows them to sort of identify the real risks and fix their controls. Okay.
Anybody else? Oh, all right. Let's give Stuart a big round of applause. Thank you so much, Stuart.